WAF is really an urban middle-class organization, professional organization, and given that there are very few professional women, does this have any role to play in terms of the women's movement or in terms of bringing about any change?
Well, I think for one thing, the composition of WF has been influenced by the time frame in which it came into existence. And I think it's important to remember that at the time we were living under martial law. And secondly, where everything, of course, then was banned. I mean, you were not allowed to have processions, you were not allowed to have print pamphlets, etc. And I think under those circumstances, WF has, of course, been accused of being a middle-class, professional, elite, urban, restricted organization. But, and therefore, its ability to play a role in society has been questioned. I think there are several things that we have to remember in this. One is that at the time that WF came into existence, Pakistan was under martial law, where many forms of registering protest or opposition to laws or actions by the government were banned. And I think it is under those circumstances that women from the middle class professional group were in a better position to have an impact, had less risks that they took in coming out on the streets. And thirdly, I think there's a question of what WF is. We started off by defining ourselves as a lobby cum pressure group in order to combat national level issues with policymakers. And I think in that sense, we had a very definite role to play. And I think we've had an impact if you look at the various, even in terms of being a catalyst for change, in terms of the number of women's organizations that have subsequently come up, and the debate that is now on about women's issues.
But now that there's no martial laws, there's a need for it. I mean, at that time, yes, perhaps one needed to work a certain way.
Well, I think also women who are professionally employed have in Pakistan the greatest space and have managed to push back the constraints on women's lives here to the maximum possible. I think partially we feel therefore the impingement on what have been long fought for achievements more perhaps. I think always women in Pakistan women's rights in Pakistan have been pushed by women who are otherwise privileged in their professional or class background. I don't really see this as a question whether urban middle class professional women have a role or not. Obviously, I think we do. We have it in terms of changing opinions and as well as the ability, perhaps the privilege, to analyze the situation that we see around us.
Those making the criticism tend to be from the same class by and large, and a lot of movements have been, in fact, this type of group is the vanguard of most other movements. Why do you suppose that they are particularly critical of women, given that they play the same role?
I'm not sure exactly all the various groups which criticize WF for its particular leadership, I suppose. Certainly it's true that many, if not most of our movements here, whether it is the movement for democratic processes, whether it's trade unions, etc., all led by people from similar backgrounds. I think it is because it's new, and WF and the women's movement, not just WF, have perhaps reached now a stage where they are challenging much more the status quo than women's groups have previously. And previously, I think women's groups lobbying for women's rights were very closely connected with other political forces, whether they were politicians or trade unionists, which is a path that WF decided not to adopt. And I think that is the lack of control over WF is something which creates a lot of resentment.
You mean really the lack of control over women like them, which they may have led in other movements?
True. Yes, I mean that the lack of control.
Do you think that this might have something to do with the fact that professional women or women involved in these movements were initially led by men, and this is a movement in which men, in fact, are not involved, and women have taken to their own leadership or really identifying the issues for themselves? Do they find it, is it because they might find it threatening to them?
Well, I think it's not just threatening, but it puts into question their role as leaders of whatever movements they are. And I think the Women's Action Forum has not listened to the advice that was given to us by various political forces, trade unionists, and also other women's organizations who felt we should go in one direction or the other. And the very independence of our movements, I think, has created resentment, yes.
But has this not then caused WAF to be seen at, or is, sort of separatist and marginal?
Well, I don't think the terms separatist and marginal are interchangeable. I don't know really how people define separatist. If by separatist, it's meant that Women's Action Forum has been autonomous as a women's group, has taken its own decisions, picked up the issues that we felt were important, then yes, we are separatists. I do not think it's separatist to the point of being anti-male or excluding male from our meetings. We do have many men who have supported us and who have come out in our demonstrations. But given the context in which we live, I think it was also very important that there be women's groups where it is women who are there taking the decisions and speaking out. Because all too frequently when you have a mixed gender meeting, you find that the women shut up. They don't speak out. I remember one meeting very early on in Karachi where women had come to speak about other students who had been raped. If they had been meeting men present at those meetings, I don't think those women would have talked about their experience and would therefore not have shared their concern with us. And therefore...
But given if WAF is just picking up women's issues, doesn't this lead to sort of an apolitical situation?
I don't think the women's issue is apolitical. I think people accuse the Women's Action Forum of being apolitical, meaning that we have not aligned ourselves with any one political party or one political group. The women's issue, I think, is very political. It's perhaps more political than the political parties' manifestos want to go. As women's rights groups, I think we are challenging structures which go beyond simply changing the faces of those in power. So I don't see that as a valid question or criticism.
Was it politic then for Women's Action Forum to use Islam to mobilize and as a way of mobilizing when Islam was in fact or Islamization was what WAF was struggling against?
I think in WF's positions vis-a-vis specific issues and the use or the non-use of Islam, we have to differentiate between the Islamization campaign of Ziaul Haq and even today of Nighat Sharif and the question of Islam itself. I think the question that really has to be asked is not whether WF should work within the framework of Islam or outside the framework of Islam, but whether or not the actions and strategies and positions taken by the women's movement and WF specifically empower women or not. Do you empower women where they are? I think on certain issues, the only way to empower them is to counter the monopolization of Islam by extremely conservative, what are called fundamentalist right-wing political groups. And I think WF has managed, we've managed to at least open up to some extent the debate on whether something is or is not Islamic.
It was on the law of evidence where a lot of the criticism on WAF comes, or perhaps even the debate, in terms of using Islam, an own interpretation of Islam against what the state was propounding. Could you just give a little about the law of evidence and what the position of Women's Action Forum was?
Well, with respect to the law of evidence, it was proposed that women's evidence would only be counted as half that of male adult Muslims. In fact, not just women, but everyone who's non-Muslim, as well as women, therefore the majority of the country, their evidence would not be on par with the male Muslim adult. WF thought on that point. We brought out a position paper in which we actually presented from within the framework of Islam and a Muslim context a different position from that which had been proposed by the government, and showed that this was not the only interpretation. In fact, we said that the interpretation presented by the government was actually false, and found Islamic scholars who supported our point of view, which they presented then at general meetings. There was a lot of resentment, and people didn't appreciate this. But I think there were two very divergent reactions to WAF calling these two ulama. One was from the left tendency women, and also amongst those who are better off economically speaking and who had more liberal outlooks and did not want Women's Action Forum to get it all involved in the whole debate on Islam. On the other hand, we had women who came from small neighborhoods of Lahore who not only appreciated what the ulama was saying, but actually requested that we give them tapes so that they could go back to their communities and pass on the message that what the government was proposing was not Islamic. And I think one has to, if you look at the Zia period, what you find is, what was his use of Islam? What was the impact it had? I don't think the majority of this country believed that what he was doing was truly Islamic, as I think was evidenced in the results of the 1988 elections. But while laws are proposed on the basis of Islam, and when as people we are fairly ignorant about what is actually Islamic or not, it immobilized opposition. So what I'm saying is that I think we were fairly justified in doing that, to the extent that women whom you were trying to get through to were able to argue in their own communities, in their own households, against what was being proposed.
Was this a question, as far as WAF was concerned, a question of strategy or belief?
I think WF is fairly diverse in terms of the women who make up WF. We do not share one consolidated political tendency or position, and I think there are women in WF who believe this as a matter of faith. I think there are others who believe this is something that is strategically necessary, even if they may or may not accept the validity of what is being suggested.
But if an organization, I mean, as an organization, where does it stand? It now surely has to take some stands on these issues. Is it using Islam strategically, or is it a matter of belief as an organization?
I don't think WF has decided whether it has a strategic position on Islam or whether it is a matter of faith. I do think the question is being debated. And far from being resolved, I think people are very divided on this issue. And one knows people who, though otherwise do not believe, are not believers in that sense, who advocate the use of Islam. One also knows people who say that they are great believers, but feel that religion is a matter to be kept in the home.
But what would you say to the the sort of immorality, say, inherent in this, that one is criticizing the Maulvis for a selective, or the state using Islam selectively and the things that suit them, and the women's movement, Women's Action Forum in particular, is using other verses to support itself. So it's as involved in the selective use of religion, and therefore as immoral and incorrect.
I'm not sure about the morality of this. I do know that there are no forces currently in Pakistan that I can think of who have worked out a complete ideology of what they believe should be Pakistan's position within an Islamic framework. And in that I include the Jamaat-e-Islami and those that claim this for themselves. I think religion has different faces to it. I think there's religion as faith, and there's religion as a cultural entity in which we live, and there's religion as a political force. And I think while WF is trying to work out a strategy, I'm not sure whether it will evolve a consensus on this. I do believe that we live in a cultural framework which is Muslim, and just as the various phases of patriarchy are culturally different in different environments, I do believe the responses are also culturally different.
But are you not uncomfortable with using Islam or using it to suit your purposes when you want to, and yet being critical of the state for using it differently and as selectively?
No, because I think the people's Islam is not the Islam of the state, and I think it is far more tolerant in terms of allowing people to live their own lives than the monolithical version that has been proposed by the state of Pakistan, not just by our state. Internationally, there's a move to try and cut out all diversity in Islam and to give you just one final version. I don't think this has been the case in Muslim history. You have had people on both sides being Muslim, claiming that they have the real Islam, and at loggerheads. I think that in itself is a fallacy to believe that there is just one version of Islam. So in that sense, no. Who is defining for me my religion? Who is defining for me my culture? I think we have a right to decide for ourselves as women and as citizens of this country what we agree to be our culture and what we think is our religion.
But if one uses it as Islam at all to get through to or to identify with a larger number of women who may be believers, aren't we ultimately reinforcing Islam? Or because we're saying that the ultimate word is the Quran and is God, regardless of the interpretation, but the Quran is ultimate and you can't go outside of it.
I don't think that we are saying that Islam and the Quran are ultimate, especially since there's no agreement on what that ultimate could possibly be. Sorry, Bunny, you'll have to repeat the question. There's a second point which is on that.
The point was only that are we not reinforcing Islam if we use it? Because ultimately we are, even if we have a liberal interpretation, we're still saying that the Quran is the ultimate word. So we're sort of giving it a finality, and we're saying we can't therefore go outside of it. We can be liberal within it, but we can't go beyond it or outside of it.
I think as Women's Action Forum and also the women's movement, we are already outside the framework of Islam in many instances. So I don't think that that is a question. As far as at a more general level, the question of whether we should be saying, are we reinforcing Islam, etc., I'm not sure what else you would be reinforcing if you're talking about a culture rather than the ultimate authority of Islam. To talk about the United Nations Charter of Human Rights, which is something which is often suggested, I don't think has that much relevance to the people's lives in this country. If you go to the majority, if you go to rural areas, and I know it's been suggested that Women's Action Forum, by remaining within or partially remaining within Muslim framework, is reinforcing the very thing which is oppressing women. my answer to that would be to suggest to those people doing the criticism that they try and go to any village and sit there and talk about the UN Charter of Rights and see if that has an impact in terms of raising consciousness and in terms of mobilizing the women to fight for their own rights where they are situated, not in the United Nations Plaza in New York. My experience, and I think everyone has different experiences, has been that to raise consciousness and to allow women to take their own decisions about their actions, you have to speak within an idiom which is familiar to them. And for the present in Pakistan, Islam is very much a reality of people's lives. It's not something which they view as something from the past, which is dissociated from their rights as women or the family or whatever else it is. I think it is very
Has Women's Action Forum made any members because it has taken this position of within Islam? I mean, any activists, not vague members somewhere.
I don't think...
Has anyone been drawn to it because of this position?
I don't actually know why women who join Women's Action Forum have actually joined, whether it's because of our stance or whether it's because of the issues that we have taken up. I think largely our success will be found to come from the issues we pick up. That if there is violence against women, we are trying to do something about it. If we are fighting against the proposed law of evidence or the Sharia bill or whatever it is, then we are trying to resist that, or we are trying to overthrow negative legal rights or the environment in Pakistan. I think that is what decides whether women join us or not.
But those women you're talking about who haven't read the UN Charter actually have not read the WAF Charter either. So what you have in the preamble of the WAF Charter is as irrelevant because they are also just interested in the issues. And therefore you can say in the preamble that which may be your position, that politics should have nothing to do, or religion should have nothing to do with politics in the state.
Well, I think Women's Action Forum has actually taken a position whereby it has said, we've said that we do not agree with any laws being passed based on the basis of religion, which to me is fine. I think that's a very clear position, but it doesn't resolve the problem of dialoguing with people and mobilizing them against or for on a particular issue. And I think that is where the question lies, not so much on whether you want religious laws. I think we don't. We don't want religious laws, we don't want Christian laws. We want laws which are just, not because they happen to be from X or Y source. But in terms of mobilization and in terms of convincing people, I think that is where the question of Islam working within a Muslim framework or not.
And do you think that this has helped Women's Action Forum? I mean, it has increased because of this?
I don't think it's particularly helped increase the numbers in Women's Action Forum. However, I think Women's Action Forum has been a catalyst in having or bringing about other women and women who are completely dissociated with WAF, probably would not want to be associated with WAF, who suddenly today, in newspaper interviews, in other forums, are taking this position, which I don't think was the case 12, 15 years ago before Women's Action Forum came in and was active and kept saying that women have to have equal rights. They have to have equal rights if the law is passed on the basis of Islam. We've countered it from within Islam, but otherwise, because we feel that women are equal to men.
Why do you suppose that the Maulvis, or religious fundamentalists, Ziaul Haq, when he took over and subsequently, why is their focus or their target women? What is this whole preoccupation with women?
Well, I think that's a question many of us ask ourselves fairly frequently. Personally, I think it has to do with a question of power. I think that partially when the state uses Islam, or when Maulvis talk about making things Islamic. Women are fair targets as being the least organized, the least financially important, etc. It's very easy to put a veil on women and say, look how Islamic we've become, and sort of ignore the economic underpinnings of what you are doing. The other thing is, when you look at the Malvi's opposition to the Family Laws Ordinance, which is something that we did, you find the real reason for their opposition to that ordinance lies not so much in a desire to control or to make things Islamic or un-Islamic, so much as to propagate, perpetuate their own basis of power, which is controlling at the level of the family and society what is Islamic or not. And I don't know why otherwise they're obsessed with women. I do think it's something which would have to be examined in far greater detail. I think partially perhaps the type of women that they're in confrontation with, which is your urban middle class professionals, who seem to bother them the most as compared to rural women whom they don't seem to be so much interested in. We've never heard the Malvis say, for instance, that no women should be allowed to go out and work in the fields, and how terrible it is that women are back and forth transporting water and food and looking after the animals. What they say is that urban women should not be in offices. Urban middle class professional women should not be doing a whole variety of things which they see us doing. And I think partially perhaps they are wary of the influence we may possibly have as role models for the women in their own class background, which I think is different from the activists, at least of Women's Action Forum, or many of the activists.
But Islam has this inherent in it in a lot of other countries of the woman becoming the symbol of where they may be culturally, in a more obvious sense, whether you can drive, what you can wear, where you walk, what space you go into. The whole fundamental Islamic preoccupation with women.
Well, I think
is it something
it's using women as symbols of your identity, opposing symbols to the West, whereas in fact you're adopting the economic and political structures of the West, and of course the technology and etc. So in that sense, it's simple to say, here are women, we are very Muslim, so don't talk to us about international debts and interest rates and etc. The other thing is that I think perhaps one theory is that in fact the teachings of Islam, if you look at the Quran anyway, are not as restrictive on women as, for instance, the laws of Christianity or Judaism. And perhaps as a way to counter the rights given to them, this has evolved over the centuries as a means of the patriarchal structure to control women far more. But as I said, I'm not really sure. And it is a debate, not just in Pakistan, a debate, or it's a question that women activists ask themselves frequently throughout the Muslim world, is why are Malvis so obsessed with women?